everyone. Can you hear me now?
Lovely.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate so much all of the work putting this together. It's a phenomenal experience to watch this, and I watched a good bit of it even early this morning. But I appreciate being here, and I really send my greetings to everyone, and especially Jane and Maria and Eric's family. And I'm sure they're watching with tremendous interest from South Dakota, and are delighted as Eric's friends and colleagues from around the world show their appreciation and admiration for him. Okay, I will. Wait, wrong one. See how I do this. There it is. There we go. Well, my own relationship with Eric officially began in 1974 in Ed Cushing's lab at Minnesota. Ed was the PhD advisor for both of us, but of course, an important co-mentor for both of us was Herb Wright, who had created a research environment that emphasized science, friendship, encouragement, and collaboration among everyone who passed through the doors of the LRC. The resulting global family, and that's how I've always thought about it, is really well represented in the talks today. Eric's approach to science in the spirit of collaboration and friendship was really a direct outgrowth of that Minnesota environment. And I think Eric's career can justifiably be viewed as a tribute to Herb and Ed themselves. Eric's and my careers were closely connected from the very beginning, and as his were to many of yours. But our collaboration has never really ended, even up to today, as several colleagues and I work on a final paper in a long series growing from the Lake Tulane project. But I won't talk today about any of the science projects or of our partnership in working to create the European pollen database and so forth. Instead, I'd like to provide a few stories from our personal lives and adventures. Although Eric and I spent many, many days together coring lakes in Minnesota, the Northern Great Plains, and especially Florida, I'll single out one day in particular. In July 1996, I'd flown from Maine to North Dakota to join Eric and others in an expedition to collect a sediment core from Kettle Lake, which Kathy had mentioned. Kettle Lake is in the far northwestern corner of the state. The project involved problems of fire ecology. Jim Clark was involved, vegetation history, geochemistry, and other things, as you know from the resulting papers. Fortunately, this expedition was before oil was discovered in the very same area. So our experience was of a peaceful, beautiful, and deep lake nestled within the prairie grasses of that region. But that coring trip included the most amazing moment in all of my experience coring lakes, and that's a lot of experience. And I know that Eric felt the same way because we talked about it frequently. As usual, we extruded the core segments and we would draw the spatula across the mud to remove the smeared outer layer so that we could have a brief field description of the stratigraphy of that segment. But suddenly, instead of the usual smooth pass of the spatula over the mud, we heard a really distinct click, click, click as the edge of the spatula passed over thin glass-like layers of a mineral later identified by Joe Donovan as struvite. Kathy mentioned that. You'll hear a lot more about Kettle Lake later from Joe, Jim Almendinger, probably Sherry Fritz, and others perhaps. Eric and I had both grown up in Rapid City, South Dakota, where our fathers were close friends and professors together at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. My father was a civil engineer, Eric's was a mathematician. But because Eric and I were 5 years apart in age, I was older. And because we lived on opposite sides of town, we never met one another as children. That had to wait for Ed Cushing's lab. Nevertheless, it turned out that our childhoods were independently full of the same great experiences in the natural beauty of the Black Hills, where we had gone camping, exploring caves without our parents ever knowing about it, of course, uh, learning about nature and lots of other things. The common heritage that defined by that childhood really defined our relationship to get forever. It created a deep and lasting, excuse me. Well, a deeply personal aspect, that's what I meant to say, to our scientific collaboration in research and working to create the EPD and lots of other things. Eric and I returned to the Black Hills as often as we could, which was quite a few times in subsequent years. And when we didn't do it, we talked about it on the phone a great deal in between. But when we were there, I wouldn't really say we relived our childhoods, but instead, because we'd had those similar childhoods, we were simply extending our childhoods. We really never stopped being kids having fun. And I know we both thought of it that way. So I'll mention just a few of our adventures. The Black Hills, shown here in a Google Earth view, is roughly 100 miles, 160 kilometers long, and about half that much wide. And we lived in Rapid City there on the east side, as you can see. This old geologic map of the hills shows the basic structure as it's understood. Eric was a very good geologist and loved to talk about the various rock strata that we were driving through all the time. But that outer ring of sort of brownish, pinkish material is limestone. It's a major limestone area that's had water passing through and dissolving caverns for millions of years. And there's some huge caves in the southern hills, some of which Kathy mentioned, but there are others all over the place, and one that I'll come back to later. But the Black Hills also have some other features that are related, including the famous Badlands of South Dakota out to the east. In the Eocene time, after the demise of the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous, the Gulf of Mexico basically had its shores almost on the edge of the Black Hills. With no ice on Earth, the sea level was so much higher that the marine embayment from that opening came all the way up to the Black Hills. And these are shallow marine sediments deposited during Eocene time, and they contain all kinds of fossils of small early mammals that were evolving, and also marine organisms that were living in the water itself. And so as kids, we'd go out there, and after a rainstorm, and we could pick up spectacular pieces of bone and show one of our paleontologist friends and he would say, "Oh, that's an early pig femur, or that's a horse whatever." And of course, this was all spectacular things for us to see and learn. We didn't pursue that end of paleoecology, but it certainly inspired our interest. And it was just a beautiful area to camp in and so forth. The southern Black Hills, however, has some significant herds of bison, or buffalo as we always called them. Turned out some of the last remaining bison that survived the slaughter of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them in the 18th century were remaining in the southern hills, and were used to restock the herds that are present today. But there were some farmers and ranchers in the area who also were raising bison by the time we were in grad school. And Eric and I, on a trip in 1976, just after I'd finished my PhD and was ready to head off to Washington and then ultimately to Maine, decided to take a trip to the Black Hills. And we went up to a ranch of his roommate from South Dakota State University, Scott Phillips. And Scott and his father owned about 30,000 acres of land, ranch land up there, that included beautiful river bottom land, and they were raising cattle and some crops, but also some bison for commercial purposes. So, but they'd also had a stock pond. There was a couple of ridges on a hillside that had been dammed off with an earthen dam and to form a pond for the stock, and their fish had been put in there. So Eric loved to go fishing. So we got our fishing gear together, drove up there, and had a great day fishing. The young lad between us here was a nephew, I think, of Scott Phillips. But But it wasn't as simple as this photo implies, because when we got there and we're getting set up to go start our fishing with our spinning rods and reels and so forth, Eric suggested that the young boy and I go to the far side of the dam and fish on the other side, and while he stayed near where his car was. So we got over there and we started fishing, and then all of a sudden we saw some motion up the slope to our left on the ridge we were standing on, and this is what we saw. And I'm not kidding. It looked just like this. There were about 24 buffalo that somebody was herding down to the lowland, the valley below us. And without any warning, it was nothing like the movies where you hear a big rumble before the buffalo stampede arrives. It was just instantaneous buffalo period coming over the ridge right down at us. And I have to say, it was the most terrifying moment of my life because it was so unexpected. So I immediately hollered, run. And so the young boy and I we ran across the dam in case the bison wanted to run near us. But anyway, they passed safely down to the bottom and we went back and caught these fish. Well, Eric loved to tell that story of us having to escape across the dam. And he always told it by saying that as we were running across the dam, I was in the lead of that poor boy who was following behind me. And I always protested that version of the story, but I have to admit there may be some truth to the way Eric told it, that it was a moment I'll never forget. Well, we came back later in that same trip. We got up into the Black Hills and we got to visit some of the old mining ruins that we'd seen as children, and all kinds of places we'd gone together, remnants of ghost towns, including some still active miner saloons. But we had a great time, and we got out into some valleys, and by then we were interested in trying to find anything that would give us paleoecological records from the Black Hills, of course. And so here's Eric captured me with a soil auger out in a valley bottom, hoping to find some organic sediments. We didn't have any luck with that, but the setting was interesting. And Eric sent me this photo later. This is a photo taken on the Custer expedition, the George Armstrong Custer expedition through the Black Hills in 1874. And there was an official government photographer who took lots of photographs that could easily be recaptured because the landscape is so clear. And this particular photo shows how many more trees there are on the landscape today after fire suppression in the 20th century than were there back when Custer was there 100 years before, almost exactly. And of course, by then, Eric and I were well interested in fire ecology, and that, of course, became a major force of factor in Eric's work, not only in the big woods and the prairies, but the work at Kettle Lake and lots of other things. So this was a fun time. Another thing we did on that same trip was to locate a small stand of a species of willow called Salix candida that Eric knew about. It existed in one small locality in the hills, and we managed to find it. And here's Eric proudly showing off the Salix candida. But we had a great time. Well, I mentioned earlier the limestone ring about the Black Hills and all the caves that are present in the southern part of the hills, especially. Well, in 1988, I was on a sabbatical at Lund University in Sweden. In fact, I was going around starting to give talks around Europe, promoting the idea of creating a database to share data for purposes we all understand. But Eric had just been hired by the Illinois State Museum, and by working with colleagues, Russ Graham, Bonnie Stiles, and Bruce McMillan, who was the director of the museum, and he honestly adored all three of those people and other wonderful colleagues at the museum as well. So I happened that I already knew Russ Graham because about 3 or 4 years earlier, Russ had been working on a project with Rob Bonnickson, who was a colleague of mine at Maine. And there was a project they were working on in the Pryor Mountains in southern Montana. And I visited that site one summer, and one of the projects going on there was the excavation of a pit, a shield trap cave, it was called, but it was really a pit cave in which there was a small surface opening that opened in a bell-shaped cavern into a surface below that had a huge pile of mammal bones on it. And animals that had fallen through the thing. So I had told Eric about that interesting experience in the Prior Mountains, and that, you know, once he talked about Russ, and I said that I had been up there with Russ, and Eric said, well, you know, I think there's a place, something like that in the Black Hills. So he and his dad had been there about 15 or 20 years before with a friend of theirs, Watson Parker. But they couldn't quite remember where it was. So Eric and his dad got out some maps and pored over them and figured out roughly where it might be. And Eric and I took off in his Jeep, and we brought a rope ladder with us and a flashlight.
My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
And passed on, drove around until we finally located the site that Eric finally recognized. And it looked like this hole in the ground looked like this. Now, there were no feet around it or rope or anything else, because this was just the bare surface of the limestone rock. And so here was the place, in fact, and it was pretty neat. It was purely black. We sounded the bottom with a rope, and we discovered that we had almost enough of a rope ladder to reach the bottom, not quite, but within a meter or something like that. So we decided to tie the ladder off to a tree, and I volunteered to go first and climb down with the flashlight in my back pocket. Of course, we didn't have any headlamps or anything like that that would have come in handy. So I was climbing down in the pitch dark, and the farther I went down, the more the pendulum was swinging back and forth. And finally, the thought of stepping off the bottom of that ladder into a surface whose location was not even known didn't appeal to me anymore as much as I was swinging. So I climbed all the way back up, and Eric went down, and he did go to the bottom and found all kinds of bones. And that started in a series of research projects involving Russ and others from the museum that went on for a long time. So it was really a fun experience, and something that led to a lot of productive science, just as the coring of Kettle Lake did. I mean, the science that came out of both of those particular projects was just enormous. This is a photo Rolf Mandel sent me recently of Eric properly prepared to go down in a cave with a headlamp and a helmet and all rigged up to go down on a power winch. So that's what would have been better the first time. Well, Eric, without any question, the Black Hills were part of Eric, and I'm sure that Eric will always be part of the Black Hills. The last time I had a chance to see Eric physically was about almost 3 years ago when we visited Eric and Jane in Jefferson for a few days. And Eric took us to a Mexican restaurant that served beer in a contraption like this. I can't remember if it had tomato sauce in it or salsa or something, but it was drunk with a straw. It was some special thing. And but this makes me think how much Eric would appreciate the toast today, and how much he would really appreciate the chance if he could have toasted back everybody present. But all of this has made me think a lot about Eric and about what it was that made it so special to be around him. And I decided finally a few days ago that it was just this, that every day spent with Eric was a happy day.